Picture this: a bustling restaurant in Oregon, where the sound of clinking glasses and lively chatter fills the air. A waiter, visibly frustrated, storms through the dining area, tray in hand. Without a second thought, he flings the tray toward a man at a nearby table, his actions fueled by assumptions he might regret. But here's the twist: this isn't just any diner. The man sitting there happens to be the governor of Oregon. What led to this shocking moment, and how did the situation spiral so quickly? As customers gasp and phones whip out to record the incident, the air grows thick with tension. The waiter's face shifts from anger to sheer disbelief as realization sets in. Who was this man he targeted, and what drove such a drastic action? In this video, we're diving deep into this jaw-dropping encounter, a moment that challenges perceptions, exposes biases, and leaves everyone asking, how could this happen? Stay tuned as we unravel the events leading up to this explosive scene, hear from those who witnessed it, and discover how a single decision can change everything in an instant. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The incident took place at a popular local diner known for its cozy atmosphere and diverse clientele. But on this particular day, something seemed off. The waiter, who had worked at the diner for years, was having a rough shift. Overwhelmed by a series of demanding tables and an argument with a coworker, his patience was wearing thin. When the man sitting at the table ordered a meal, the waiter didn't expect him to be someone important. He assumed he was just another customer. But there was something about the man's calm demeanor, his poised presence, that seemed to annoy the waiter even more. Maybe it was the way he sat there, exuding an air of confidence, or how he made small talk with the waitress while waiting for his food. In a moment of frustration, the waiter snapped, tossing the food tray in the direction of the table without thinking. As the food scattered across the floor, the room fell silent. The man at the table didn't react right away. It wasn't until the waiter turned, realizing who he had just humiliated, that the true weight of the situation began to unfold. The diner's patrons were now watching with bated breath, and the tension in the air was palpable. The waiter's face drained of color as the governor stood up slowly, his expression unreadable. But it wasn't just the governor who was affected. This incident was about to set off a chain reaction no one saw coming. As the governor stood, the room seemed to shrink. All eyes were on him, but his calm demeanor didn't crack. Instead, he quietly picked up a napkin and began wiping his suit, now stained with food. The silence in the diner was deafening. The waiter froze in place, his face a mix of shock and dread. He seemed to realize the gravity of his mistake, but it was too late to take it back. Among the patrons, whispers began to spread. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene while others debated what had just happened. Who would dare act like that towards someone so important? But then came the other side of the conversation. Those who didn't recognize the governor were simply confused. To them, it was just another heated moment in a busy restaurant, though the tension in the air hinted that this was anything but ordinary. Meanwhile, the governor's security detail, stationed discreetly near the entrance, began moving toward the table. Their expressions were stone cold, assessing whether the situation posed a further threat. But the governor held up a hand, signaling them to stay back. He wasn't just a leader in title, he knew the power of his actions in moments like these. At a nearby table, a young woman with her laptop open had been quietly observing the entire exchange. She had recognized the governor the moment he walked in. Now, she was piecing together what had triggered the incident, and she wasn't the only one. Everyone in the room was wondering the same thing. What would the governor do next? And what had driven the waiter to such a shocking act? The weight of the unanswered questions kept the tension simmering as the governor's next move loomed over the entire diner. The governor stood completely still for a moment, his gaze fixed on the waiter, who now looked like he wanted to disappear. Every pair of eyes in the diner was locked on this unfolding drama, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. No one dared to move, unsure of what was about to happen. The governor's calm, measured steps as he approached the waiter only added to the suspense. Officer Down finally received a response on his radio. But instead of clarifying the situation, it only seemed to raise more questions. The dispatcher's voice hinted at something unusual in the man's file, but the details were unclear. Dan's demeanor shifted slightly, his unease now mixed with frustration. Why did this interaction feel so complicated? Why couldn't this man just explain himself fully? The officer's doubts fueled his determination to maintain control, even as he struggled with the nagging feeling that he might be making a mistake. Around them, the small crowd continued to watch intently, their murmurs growing louder. Phones were pointed in every direction, recording every second. Marcus noticed this too, realizing that the unfolding scene was no longer just a private encounter. It was a spectacle, one that could have serious repercussions. As Officer Dan began to approach the car again, hand resting on his belt, the tension reached its peak. Marcus took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever was about to come. As Officer Dan approached the car again, his movements deliberate, Judge Hayes noticed something shift in the officer's expression. It wasn't just authority or frustration anymore, it was a flicker of uncertainty, as though the pieces of a puzzle weren't quite fitting together. Dan leaned down toward the driver's side window, his voice measured but firm. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle." Marcus hesitated for the first time. He had complied with every request up to this point, but this felt like a turning moment. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, his calm still intact, though his heart raced. The murmurs from the growing crowd intensified, and the phones recording every detail now seemed to multiply. Marcus stood tall, meeting the officer's gaze, his own expression unreadable. And then it happened. As Officer Dan reached for his handcuffs, the radio crackled again, louder this time. The voice on the other end was no longer the dispatcher but the police chief. "Officer Dan, stand down immediately. That man is Judge Marcus Hayes." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The crowd quieted, the phones stopped shaking in uncertain hands, and even Officer Dan froze, his hand hovering in midair. The weight of those words hung heavy, but the tension was far from resolved. The officer's grip on authority was slipping, and Marcus knew this moment could change everything, not just for him, but for how stories like this were told. Officer Dan's face went pale as the weight of the police chief's words hit him. He stepped back slightly, his posture no longer that of control, but of confusion and unease. The crowd, sensing the shift, began murmuring louder, their phones still trained on the unfolding drama. Judge Hayes stood motionless, his calm exterior unbroken, though inside he felt the gravity of what had just happened. This wasn't just about a mistaken identity, it was about how easily things could have gone differently. The officer stammered, trying to find the right words. I didn't realize. Your Honor, I didn't know." His voice trailed off, his authority completely stripped away. Marcus nodded slowly, his measured tone cutting through the tension. "I understand, officer, but not recognizing someone doesn't excuse how they're treated. Would you have handled this differently if you knew who I was from the start?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Before Officer Dan could respond, the police chief himself arrived on the scene, stepping out of his car with a mix of urgency and frustration. He approached Marcus first, offering an apology that felt sincere but too late. Then he turned to Dan, his tone sharp and controlled. "We'll discuss this later. Right now, we need to address this situation with transparency." As the chief spoke, Marcus glanced back at the crowd. This moment wasn't just about him or the officer anymore. It had become a lesson, captured on countless phones, about accountability and the power of perception. Just as he prepared to leave, a man from the crowd stepped forward, handing Marcus his phone. "I think you want to see this," the man said. The screen played a video of Officer Dan's initial approach, showing a subtle but unmistakable bias in his tone and body language. Marcus watched quietly, then looked at the officer. "This isn't just about me. It's about what this means for everyone who doesn't get the chance to have their story heard." The officer, visibly shaken, nodded, realizing the depth of his actions. And as Judge Hayes walked away, the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air, a moment that was both a reckoning and a call for change. As Judge Hayes walked back to his car, the crowd began to disperse, some still murmuring about what they had witnessed. The weight of the encounter lingered, not just for Marcus, but for everyone who had been there. It wasn't the first time a moment like this had unfolded.